It's time for our second big entry in 1990's RPG Showdown. Dragon Quest IV was first, and here's the very confusingly titled Wizardry III Knight of Diamonds, the second scenario. Now, as somebody watching this video decades after the game's release, you might think that putting Wizardry right next to Dragon's Quest is a little bit ridiculous. But it really cannot be understated how big Wizardry was at the time. At this moment, it's the number 2 RPG franchise on the Famicom. It had almost as much hype as Dragon Quest IV did. The release of the last game in the original Wizardry trilogy was going to be a big deal. Okay, now we have to step back a little bit. Wizardry was one of the 2 foundational entries in computer RPGs, the other being Ultima. It laid down what computer RPGs would be like, and throughout the 1980s, most of them were either direct clones of Wizardry or Ultima. Well, Wizardry fell to the wayside pretty quickly, and part of that might be due to how they released the sequels. You see, Wizardry II and III weren't standalone games. They were expansion packs for Wizardry I. New dungeons, but not new games. When it came to the Famicom releases, ASCII released Wizardry I and then chose to skip straight to Wizardry III. Legacy of Theogamin was regarded as the ultimate challenge for Wizardry, so it made a certain kind of sense to make that the sequel. But Japanese players were still hungry for more Wizardry, and Wizardry IV had some, problems that are well beyond the scope of this video. So they jumped back to Wizardry II, Knight of Diamonds, which could be summed up as Wizardry Easy Mode. As I did with the previous 2 Famicom Wizardry games, I went into the options menu and changed all the language settings to English. This is a feature ASCII will keep in their Wizardry ports well into the PlayStation era. Not the Game Boy games, though. Those just didn't have enough memory. One more thing you can turn off and on in the options menu are original dungeon graphics. Since this is my final outing for the Wizardry series on the Famicom, I thought I'd go with the 1981 styling for most of my playthrough. Drilling down to the mechanics of Wizardry would take quite a bit of time, and I already did it in the first Wizardry video. So I'm just going to stick to the basics here. You create characters of the standard fantasy classes, and build a party of 6. Your party can be good or evil, but you can't mix good and evil characters. Once you have your party assembled, you go get them equipped at the shop, and then set them loose in the maze. These are played from a first-person perspective, and hitting the A button will advance you 1 square, as well as open a door in front of you. The B button will set up camp where you are, which will allow you to access some party features. You can encounter enemies while just wandering the halls, but it's more common to encounter them as you burst into a room. In battle, the first 3 people in your party may attack physically, and any slot can cast magic spells. Enemies are often unidentified and just given a kind of vague class at first, and then after a round or 2 of fighting them, you figure out who they are. After combat, you'll typically find a treasure chest, and here you have to have someone identify the trap on the chest before you should open it. Once the trap is identified, then you can disarm it and get the tasty loot inside. Items that you find in the dungeon will be considered unidentified until you go back to town, take it to a shop, and pay them to tell you what it is. Also in town, you can rest at the inn. If you pay for a room, the character staying in it will very slowly recover health. You really should be using magic to heal instead. For some reason, only 1 character can rest at a time, and resting takes a minimum of a week. Resting is also how you get your spells back, though you don't need to pay for a room for that. Resting is also how you level up. When you rest, you're told how much experience you need for your next level, and if you've leveled up, usually these will be an increase, but sometimes they're not. What makes Knight of Diamonds different from Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord and Legacy of Theogamin is that the enemies on the first floor are much easier. I stuck to that first floor in my hour of play, and very few of the random encounters ever even hit me. I took my characters up to level 3 and even went off to challenge the first boss. Well, Wizardry doesn't have proper bosses like that. This would just be a higher powered static encounter. You can easily build up to level 4 or 5 here without too much risk. Because Wizardry is constantly saving your character information, a death early on tends to really put a crimp in your plans. If you play the other two scenarios standalone, is to just keep throwing bodies at the maze until a few of them are lucky enough to reach level 2, and then build a party out of the survivors. Now, one of the big things about Wizardry is that you are supposed to be able to transfer your characters around. You take your characters who completed the first scenario and put them into the third. On the Famicom, this was done with the ASCII Turbo file, a peripheral that added permanent external storage to the system. So what Knight of Diamonds offered was a place where you could build up your characters easily, and then transfer them to a more difficult location. The later levels do become more difficult, but it's still considered to be a relatively easy Wizardry game. If you clear the scenario here, there is something special added. This version of Knight of Diamonds has a hidden super boss. One final challenge to close out the Famicom's Wizardry trilogy. I said this in the previous 2 Wizardry videos, and it bears repeating. If you want to play the original Wizardry trilogy, I think that this is actually the best way to do it. The interface is a bit easier, and it plays much faster than the computer versions. And of the 3, Knight of Diamonds is probably the right choice to start with. That level 1 hump in Wizardry can be pretty brutal, and this will get you over it. While this is the end of the line for the Wizardry series on the Famicom, the games keep going from here. Wizardry IV will get a very strange release on the PC Engine, paired with Legacy of Kilgamin, and then later on the first 4 games are bundled together for the Saturn and PlayStation. Wizardry V is actually the next game in the Wizardry series to get wide release in Japan. The Japanese branch of the Wizardry series is an enormous topic, as there's almost twice as many Japanese exclusive games as there are Wizardry games released outside of Japan. And this Famicom series was an enormous driver of that popularity. I know it can be tough going back to an RPG that was designed in 1981, but these are historically significant games that drove a significant portion of the RPG boom in the 80s. They're well worth checking out for that reason alone.